Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this special additional meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee for Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council. Welcome to members of the committee, welcome to members of the council, to officers and to members of the public. And I will now ask Mr. Jones, Senior Democratic Services Officer, if he could run through the housekeeping arrangements and then move to items 1 and 2 and 3 on the agenda.
Chairman, Mr. Hanson, I'm for the housekeeping. Good evening, members. Please note that this meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee is being recorded by the Council and will be published on the Council website for a minimum of 6 months. Anyone who is on the call but not in the room and wishing to speak, would they please use the raise your hand feature and switch on your video when invited to speak. Please could members in the room only speak when invited to by the Chairman and mute their microphones when not speaking. Finally, Chairman, please also ensure that background noise is kept to a minimum and that mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. And I'd ask you now if you could deal with apologies, substitute members and declarations of interest. Thank you.
Chairman, received apologies from Councillor Daniel Butt and from Councillor Filer. And in terms of substitutes, Councillor Toby Johnson is substituting for Councillor Butt and Councillor Judes Butt is substituting for Councillor Filer. The Chairman, going to on to item 3, may I invite any members to make any declarations of interest?
There do not appear to be any, Mr. Jones. Sorry, Mr. Hampton. So that takes us on to item 4 on the agenda, confirmation of minutes. The minutes of our meeting held on the 17th of March 2022 were circulated yesterday. I hope all members have had the opportunity to read them. Are you agreed that those are a true and accurate record of our meeting on the 17th of March? Thank you very much indeed, members. Takes us to item 5 on the agenda, which is public questions. And I think I'm going to ask Mr. Jones, sorry, Mr. Hanton, to deal with the first of those, which is a public question, and then I will ask Mr. Jones if he will respond. Mr. Hanton.
Thank you. Chairman, there's one public question received. Public question for BCPC Audit and Governance Committee meeting on 31/3/22. Subject: deficiencies in democratic processes relating to public issues and agendas, following confirmation at this committee's meeting on 17/3/22 that the Council's broken web links would be identified with urgency and rectified. Public question. Noted that between 22/3/22 and 23/3/22, this committee's agenda links were enabled accessing the lengthily indexed 304-page Constitution, but not directly, the public issues criteria, entailing less than immediate transparency regarding a restrictive earlier procedural change. Public questions submitted to appropriate overseeing committees, subcommittees, cabinet, brackets, not the customary less frequent full council, close brackets, meetings, must relate to agenda specific items usually published the day before submission cut-off. Will consideration therefore be given to the concern that neither committee nor public have assured timely awareness of certain issues, e.g. my non-agended accumulating questions regarding significant infractions of law and accounting? Philip Gattrell, 24/3/22.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hanton. And I'm going to ask Mr. Jones, who's the Head of Democratic Services, to respond. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to thank Mr. Gattrell for his question. Public participation at council, cabinet or committee meetings is a discretionary facility to allow the public an opportunity to engage with the democratic process. The existing arrangements for the submission of questions and statements by the public were adopted by full council following consideration by the Constitutional Review Working Group and the Audit and Governance Committee. The Constitution should not, as a matter of routine, be constantly reviewed and updated, and members will be aware that a comprehensive review was recently completed and adopted by Council. However, the concerns raised by Mr. Gattrell in relation to public questions and statements will be referred to the Constitutional Review Working Group for consideration when they next meet. No meetings of the working group are currently scheduled, but I'd like to assure Mr. Gattrell that it will be added to their work programme for consideration. Finally, I would like to invite Mr. Gattrell to contact me direct in the first instance if he identifies or considers there to be operational deficiencies in democratic processes. I do not consider raising matters for the first time at a committee meeting to be either efficient or effective use of the committee's time. If I am able to resolve the matter, I will do so promptly or provide an explanation if this is not possible. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Jones. And on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank Mr. Gattrell for his question and indeed for the email which he circulated to all members of the Audit and Governance Committee earlier today. We now have under item 5 public issues a public statement, and I think that Mr. Hanton is going to read that public statement again from Mr. Gattrell. Mr. Hanton.
Thank you, Chairman. Public statement for BCP Audit and Governance Committee meeting on 31/3/22. Subject: proposal to amend council protocols in respect of public issue questions and statements (brackets currently limited to 100 words each) close brackets in view of the accompanying question to this committee. Public statement: impediments to timely scrutiny, remedial actions and delivering accountability. Public questions and statements relating to council business channel without subject restriction to full council. However, an individual's rights in that forum are restricted to potentially inadequate 4 of each issue type per single municipal year. Moreover, concerning infractions, although full council meetings are an essential medium for certain issues, they do not substitute for prompt consideration in the first instance by the designated overseeing committee or cabinet. Given also, as evidenced by correspondence, significant procedural contraventions and misstatements initially notified to statutory officers are susceptible to inordinate delays and opposition to satisfactory resolution. Philip Gattrell, 28/3/22.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hanton. That's the end of the public issues at item 5, and that then takes us to item 6 on our agenda, which is the substantive item for this special additional meeting of the Audit and Governance Committee. And the subject is the development of the overview and scrutiny function. So it might just be helpful if I quickly run through the history of why we're dealing with this issue this evening, and the members of the public in particular, but members generally, I think it would be useful to remember what we've been asked to do, by whom and by when. So if we go back to the requirement of council for us to look again at the options available for the development of the overview and scrutiny function, we took that on board, and a considerable amount of work has been done by officers, most particularly Lindsay Marshall, who is our overview and scrutiny specialist, together with Mr. Jones, the head of democratic services. And that work has taken a reasonable amount of time to conclude. And what I thought would be a good idea before we brought it back to Audit and Governance would be to gather together the various interested parties across the council for an informal meeting to run through the draft of that paper and the three options that it contained. The intention of that was that on its release, discussions could take place between the various political groups and their respective members in preparation for that informal meeting, which took place on Wednesday the 9th of March as a Teams meeting. And there was a long and fairly detailed discussion on that. Officers were present on that meeting in order that they could then amend as appropriate the report. And we took a view that in terms of audit and governance, that report should come straight to the committee rather than going to the Constitution Review Working Group, which is how we would normally deal with an issue like this, on the basis that we felt it would probably be too repetitive between those two meetings to make the first one worthwhile. So this is the first and only time that Audit and Governance are considering this matter directly, but of course there will be one or two members who were party to that previous meeting, which took place on the 9th of March. And perhaps for clarity, I should explain that those who were present on that meeting were the leaders and deputy leaders of each of the political groupings of the council, together with the chairs and vice chairs of the Overview and Scrutiny Board and the two Overview and Scrutiny committees. And that encompassed all of those interested parties, together with the officers who were supporting this role for us. And having done that, Lindsay Marshall put together a revised paper, which is the one that you have before you this evening. In the interim, there was a further paper distributed earlier today at my request, which was part of the Local Government Association Corporate Peer Challenge, which took place last November and which was in the bundle for Cabinet when that was released last Friday. I asked for that to be distributed to members of Audit and Governance simply because, although all members received it last Friday, it was relevant in part to our discussion this evening, and it was probably useful to have those parts of it highlighted for members of this committee rather than wading through all the other reports at that time. And so I hope you've all had the opportunity to see that and to be able to consider it in our deliberations this evening. So that's by way of what's happened up to now. What's going to happen this evening is that we will then hopefully come out with recommendations that can go forward to full council. And our requirement, if you remember, was that in doing that, it would go to the next full council meeting towards the end of April, with a view to enacting whatever arrangements are going to come forward for overview and scrutiny from the beginning of the new municipal year. And hence that rigid timescale, because if we don't do it in that order, then we won't be able to do it within that timescale. And so that's been the understanding throughout by officers and by members, and hopefully we can get to that position this evening. So we will be looking at the report that has been circulated. I will be asking officers to do a little bit of introduction in addition to what I've spoken about this evening. And I think when we begin that discussion, it might be helpful if we concentrate on the order in which we're going to deal with these issues so that we can then neatly slot those into getting to the recommendations at the appropriate time. I hope all of that makes sense to you. I think it would be helpful if perhaps I ask Mr. Jones to say a few words, and then I'm going to change over to Lindsay Marshall as our overview and scrutiny specialist, who needs to talk about just a couple of issues within there, and those I have discussed with her, and she's happy to do that. So over to you, Mr. Jones, as Head of Democratic Services.
Thank you, Chairman. And members, I won't rehearse everything that the Chair has just run through. That clearly is a history of how we've got to where we are. I'd probably jump straight into the options that are before you at this meeting. I should say that all of the options really should, or any option that we have and we come up with, should be underpinned and focus on a stable ONS function that promotes the principles of good scrutiny. Those are outlined in paragraph 13 in the report and are key to the framework that we wish to establish. For the benefit of those who are online and anybody who may be joining remotely, I can share the options if you'll just bear with me, Chair, but you have got these options within the pack. They're in Appendix 1 on pages 19, 20 and 21. Bear with me while I share. I appreciate you won't be able to see that on the screen in here, but I think it'll be useful for anybody who's watching online or joining remotely. So as I said, these are on pages 19, 20 and 21, and I think they're probably the appropriate way to look at it. It's more visual. So option 1 is no change to the current structure. So we have the Overview and Scrutiny Board with 15 members, two committees, one for Children's Services, one for Health and Adult Social Care, each with 11 members. The board meets, as you know, originally was scheduled to meet 10 times a year, and the other committees 6 times a year. In reality, the board now meets 20 times a year, so double the original number. The board has overall responsibility for scrutiny, overview and scrutiny oversight, cross-cutting issues as the lead, and call-in issues. Okay. Option 2 is the model that was presented to Council previously and was referred back. So this was retaining the Overview and Scrutiny Board, again with 15 members, retaining the overarching responsibilities and call-in, but establishing a new place Overview and Scrutiny Committee with 11 members. The principle of that was to reduce the impact or the number of meetings of ONS. It was absolutely key that that was reduced. It was unsustainable for the board to meet 20 times a year. We were hearing that from both members and officers, and therefore the establishment of a place overview and scrutiny, which was informed through engagement and other sessions, was the option and the model that was presented to Council previously and referred back. There were clearly in in referring it back, concerns regarding the overarching structure and operation of scrutiny, and I think Lindsay will probably pick up on that in terms of comments that perhaps have arisen through the peer review exercise as well. So option 3 is the replacement of the board with a corporate community overview and scrutiny committee. So this would effectively be establishing 4 committees, replacing the board and the 2 committees with 4 committees. The model in front is with 11 members serving on each. They would meet 6 times per annum. The split of the division of responsibilities is shown in that chart, again mirroring really the board responsibilities, but cross-cutting issues would then be determined. Obviously, we'd have defined remit for each of the committees, and therefore cross-cutting issues would then, the committee with the principal lead would take on those particular roles. The report suggests that that would be undertaken by the monitoring officer in consultation with the respective chairs of those committees, and then call-ins would be referred to the relevant committee. So that's the 3 options before you. They're set out. In relation to other parts of the report, paragraphs 15 through to 22 highlight the resourcing issues. So as I said just now, the additional 10 meetings was, I think, generally accepted by everybody as being unsustainable, and therefore there was a need for change. There was general consensus, I believe, for the establishment of a place committee previously. So on that basis, I would probably suggest, and obviously your chair, I'll come back to you in a moment, but option 1 is probably not a preferred option almost by anybody, and therefore, but again, we can come back to that in a moment. So I think I've covered the number of meetings. I've covered in terms of the cross-cutting issues and highlighting those in the report where they are. So they're defined in paragraphs 28 through to 32. As I said, I've given you a summary already. I'm sure members have read the report in full, and I've detailed the suggestion around call-in. So that's detailed call-in arrangements are outlined in paragraphs 33 through to 37. There's no change suggested to the number of signatures required for a call-in, so it will remain as 3 for each of the models. But in terms of option 3, where you've got 4 committees, then the 3 signatures would come from the appropriate committee for that particular area. In addition to that, the provision for 10 signatures of any member who's not an executive member still exists as well. The remaining sections of the report, Chair, relate more to do with constitution updates and suggestions. Now, there are 3 versions of the constitution set out in the agenda pack, but I think your first question is, what is the preferred option to go forward? And then I think we can examine the detail of the respective appendices relating to the constitution. So I'll probably hand back to you, Chairman, although I think you wish to bring in Lindsay. So I'll just stop sharing those options.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Phipps.
Could I just ask for clarification on something Richard said? Sorry if I've not understood. The option 2 and option 3, look, the duties of the overview and scrutiny board and committee, or committee and committee, look the same. Obviously, the board has 15 members on option 2. The committee has 11 members on option 3, but other than that, they look exactly the same. So what's the difference between a board and a committee?
James.
The difference is primarily with the overarching elements. So at the moment, the board has overarching responsibility for cross-cutting for all call-in, so regardless of subject, whereas under the committee arrangements, those cross-cutting issues, particularly leads on joint committees and call-in, would then go to the relevant committee.
So, sorry, just to follow up. So that means that in option 2, you've got the board, which has a call-in, but then the committee, which is the second overview and scrutiny, but a committee wouldn't be able to call anything in. Is that what you said?
So, sorry, Chair, but I can probably just explain. So I'll give an example. So if you had a call-in that was relating to, if we had a police committee, under option 2, that call-in would go to the board. Whereas under option 3, the call-in would go to the relevant committee related to that subject.
That understood, Councillor Phipps? Yeah. Pretty good. Thank you very much. I'd like now, just before we begin, to go to Lindsay Marshall as our overview and scrutiny specialist. And I think Lindsay's going to tell us a little bit more about a couple of the papers, the one that's distributed earlier today, which is the peer review, and a little bit about resources at paragraph 17. Ms Marshall.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I thought it would be helpful just to stress a couple of elements that are in the report, particularly around overview and resourcing for overview work, because that is a really common theme that comes up in all feedback around overview and scrutiny, and particularly in the informal meeting that was held on the 9th of March. There is a clear cross-party wish to do more overview work, proactive member-led overview work and scrutiny. And there is a commonly held view, I would say, among scrutineers and the scrutiny community that the most value will be added in overview type work, and where members can really refine a topic and look at it from a unique perspective in overview and scrutiny. Overview and scrutiny, let's remember, is uniquely placed. It has statutory powers to look at anything in the area or affecting the inhabitants of the area, and it can pull together a range of partners around a table to look at solutions and hear from different people. Members are probably more acquainted with receiving committee reports to committee meetings, perhaps policy reports that are almost fully fledged, and they might be putting some comments or stamp on it as overview and scrutiny. But when we talk about overview work, there is the potential to do really developing work, developing policy work, looking at a range of stakeholders, talking to different people, holding focus groups, surveying residents, and working in more diverse ways than we are more used to at the moment. And I would say one of the reasons for that is because a lot of capacity is taken up with supporting meeting resource and the frequency of meetings, particularly in the ONS board. So I think it's just important to bear in mind that when we're talking about overview, there is the untapped potential, I think, of members to direct their resource in that area, to do that sort of proactive task and finish type work, developing policy. And there is a lot of skill within the Democratic Services team to support those more diverse ways of working. And that can only be released if the meeting capacity is reduced from what it currently is. I'd also like to highlight the LGA peer review that's been referenced. Now, that has been published just a few days after the meeting agenda was published for today, so that's why it's not included within your papers, but as the chairman said, it's a publicly available document. But it does have a few findings that relate to overview and scrutiny, and I think it's really important that you're aware of those, and for the benefit of the public and anyone watching, that those are highlighted here. Specifically, it talks about the good work that's been taking place in the Health ONS Committee and building partnership working there. And it also highlights the good work that's been happening in this committee in audit and governance. And I think that's important to highlight because audit does undertake a form of scrutiny, and it recognises the deep dive sort of scrutiny that takes place here as something that's adding value to the council. But it also talks about that there are questions around the impact and the effectiveness of the overview and scrutiny board in its current format. It talks about a need to reset the overview and scrutiny model to ensure that it delivers on its purpose of ensuring that the council's open, transparent, accountable, and delivers improved policy and services. And the findings of the peer review also reflect on political tensions that are apparent within the council and can sometimes play out in a way that are not constructive. That's what the report says. That was recognised also at the informal meeting with members on the 9th of March. That was a cross-party recognition of that issue, and I think an understanding and a wish from all sides to work to improve that. And there were concerns about that playing out more in the ONS board than in other areas. But the LGA peer review does talk about the potential for reputational damage to the council if that is left to continue. So I think that's really important for members to take note of. And as the chair said, that was circulated earlier in the day to everybody, but I'll also include the link in the chat in case anybody hasn't been able to see that. But it's a public document, and it can be reviewed within the full context and the action plan that's associated with it if you look at the overview and scrutiny board papers or the cabinet papers for the forthcoming meetings. If I could, while I've got a moment, I would also just flag for you all, as a reminder, I think, that the remit for the proposed committees within the models that are produced for you was considered and based on analysis that was done in your previous tranche of work. Now, you don't have a lot of in-depth analysis on those remits included here, but there was a calculation done and looked at in terms of the level of different types of subject matters that go to the ONS board, and the percentages of those that were considered, and then a consideration of what would achieve the best balance across a committee structure, so that you don't have one committee that is very overburdened with work, as the ONS board currently is. So, for example, there would be no point in creating a place committee if we found that that was suddenly overburdened with a huge amount of work that we have taken from another committee and just moved a problem elsewhere. So there is a background to that remit calculation and analysis. But nevertheless, obviously, the priorities of the council can change and the portfolio holder areas can change, and there may be a need to reassign areas of remit from one committee to another over time. Written into the report is the facility to do that through the annual report on scrutiny to council. So that's just to give you assurances that if you were concerned about any of the remit areas of those committees, there is a mechanism to keep that under review. And to be frank, that's a moving feast that will always be an issue. There may be changes that will be required, and that can't be avoided. And I'd also just flag that later on, when you have looked through your options, there are constitution draftings provided for you in your appendices. There are changes that are included that are based on the options provided, and there are also a few changes that are included just to make the current rules a little bit more robust or clear where we know that that is required. And if there are any questions around those, I can certainly take you through those. But I think that the chairman would like to come on to that later in the meeting when you have had your more substantive discussion around the options.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Marshall, and again, thank you for all the work you've done in getting us to this stage this evening. I think it's clear that we have taken our remit very seriously in this matter in terms of making sure that we've looked at all the various options in as much depth as possible. And I suppose what we need to do is to get to a position whereby we have an overview and scrutiny function here in BCP Council that will withstand time and indeed the composition of the council. So it's got to be fit for purpose, regardless of the composition of the council. And I think one of the thoughts about getting this to council in April so that we can enact it for the new municipal year is that at that stage this council will only have that 1 year left to run before the elections in May 2023 and the formation of a new council with a different composition, no doubt. And so who can say where we might be at that stage? We've got to make sure that whatever we put together and recommend to council is fit for purpose or as close as we can make it, so that we don't then have to come back again in that new council to get the constitutional review working group to look at it yet again. We want something that's going to last the test of time. In terms of how I think we ought to be dealing with this, as you'll know, there are three recommendations that we will need to be looking at later on. And Ms Marshall referred actually to the second of those, which is the appendices. And I think, therefore, we will deal with those issues in preparation once we've got to a preferred option, because they neatly slot into each of the three options. And at that stage, I think I'll be asking Ms Marshall to go through those in terms of our preparation for that part of the discussion. So I think, as Mr Jones indicated earlier on, we've got three options in there. The first of which is really the do nothing option, which certainly didn't have much support when we did the meeting at the beginning of March. What would help us enormously, I think, would be if we were able to decide whether we were able to rule that option out, so that we can then deal with options 2 and 3, which were the ones that at the cross-party meeting on the beginning of March took up virtually all of the discussion at that stage. So could we perhaps just start with that, and then we can, if that is what we end up doing, without me leading you, but I do want to make sure that we've got a proper discussion around the substantive options which seem to be coming out of that process cross-party. So who'd like to start that part of our discussion this evening? Councillor Cox.
I'll give my 2 pennies worth, what is that? As to ruling it out, I think your question is, should we rule that one out first? I'd rather do a sort of a proportional vote as to an alternative vote, 1, 2 and 3 is the way I would like to run it if I was doing Senate. Because the way I look at this at the moment, just from what I've read, is that that would be my second option, not my first option. And therefore, I believe option 3 to be the worst option from our point of view, from the council point of view. But that's my argument. That's so. In terms of ruling it out, I wouldn't rule it out. I would just say, well, it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's a second option, but I wouldn't. I think it's a worse option. Does that make sense?
I see. Well, I'm quite easy. I'm in your hands to a large degree, actually, members of the committee. I was only trying to facilitate a process that might help us get to a conclusion more quickly, having got some definition, rather than ending up with setting options out to individual vote. But if that's the way the committee wants to go, I'm perfectly easy with it. Councillor Buck.
Yes, thank you. Whilst we might have personal opinions on this, I was mindful of what we've just been told. What we've just been told is I'll take my mask off just to speak with you if that assists. Nobody agree with me. I'm very mindful of what we've been told with regard to the huge tranche of work that has got us here today. And the advice that we've had at the peer review, which also reflects that, we've heard from Ms Marshall saying that option 1, it's broken, it doesn't work, we need to move away from it. I've read this very, very carefully, and of all the options, that is one that I would rule out immediately because it's not working. And I think that's why we're here, because we need to change it, we need to make it work. So starting from ground level, that one doesn't work. I would not support it in any way, shape or form. I think it's slowly over time become a bit of a leviathan with the overview and scrutiny board, which in the first instance was set in very good faith. I'm sure it's become cumbersome and has taken the huge share of the work, and it's become very difficult for everybody and very costly. I think all credit to the chairman of that committee for actually managing to keep going as long as he has. So, as I said, I think that one can be ruled out immediately, and I would not support option 1. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Buck. Did you want to come back, Councillor Cox?
Yeah, just to be clear, I'm not that much in favour of option 1 either, to be honest. And I do feel actually that there may be a fourth option. Is in terms of option 2 is to and I completely agree with the sentiments in terms of the way that the Overview Scrutiny Board is working, and I take on board all of the criticisms, and I think there will be fair criticisms, completely fair criticisms, that it has become what was that big word? Yes, it's a good word, and therefore, so I would agree that, but that board in itself and that workload could be changed, could be reformed. But I do find that the scrutiny board in itself, is a good powerhouse for getting stuff done and for getting criticisms noted, and whereas the other options would be quite weak alternatives. So I accept all of the criticisms of the Overview Scrutiny Board, which I usually agree with, which I do agree with, but they can be reformed. That the way that committee works can be reformed with a bit of willpower, and I think that would be a better option.
Thank you, Lawrence. Do you mean reformed, the definition reformed, or reformed as in made better and tightened up? What phraseology were you using there? Thank you.
Reformed as in made better and tightened up, and to take the the anger out of it, and to try and make it a bit more collegiate rather than us against them, which I completely accept it is.
Well, of course, that's a substantial point within the peer review, isn't it? And I think we are charged as a committee to try and find a way through that. part of the reason for holding the meeting with all parties on the 9th of March was very much about trying to get to a position that would garner support across the council. I know it was probably unlikely to have that outturn, and indeed I think I would say we didn't have that outturn, but at least we've tried. So if the consensus, or indeed even if it's a minority, would like to leave all three options on the table for this debate this evening, that is fine. I will, unless there's a move to the contrary at some stage in the evening, I will be looking at each of those options and to go to a vote on each of the three of them. But again, members, I'm in your hands as to procedurally how we progress through the discussion. I'm mindful, I'm using the word discussion rather than debate. I do that deliberately because whatever comes out at the other end, it would be good if it can be taken to council and has widespread support, but I do realise that it may not. But what I do think is that we don't want to have this issue back with us again. I'm determined that we don't get it back with us again, because I don't think any advantage would be made for anybody if we were to do that. It just puts off the moment and means that we won't have it for the new municipal year. And I'm absolutely clear about that. So I will open it up to a discussion around all three options, and no doubt a majority will coalesce around one of those three, unless there's a move to some other way forward during the debate. So who'd like to begin? Thank you, Councillor Brooke.
It's to ask a question rather than to start the discussion, and that is, if we've got other members and other chairs present, either physically or being streamed, when are you going to bring them into any of the discussion? Because it would be useful for us to hear what their views are, in a way, before we actually have our discussion. Then we've heard all the information, whereas if we have our discussion first and then other information, that could prolong the discussion, insofar as we then might have to come back to some of the other points that have been raised, whereas we can take them when we're having our discussion. In a way, a little bit like the planning committee operates. All the information and questions are dealt with first, and then the final sort of discussion or debate.
Quite happy to do that. Of course, most, if not all, were present at the meeting on 9th of March, but of course a number of members of the Audit and Governance Committee were not, because it wasn't a meeting for members of this committee. I have one member in the room in the presence of Councillor Burton. I wonder, Mr. Hanton, who else is online amongst those chairs or vice chairs of the others?
Just as I told you.
That hasn't changed. So, in answer to your question, Councillor Brooke, the others are not actually on the meeting. They hadn't indicated in advance, actually, because I checked that this morning, but I just wanted to make sure that those that are actually on the screen and there aren't any. Okay, so I'm quite happy to go to Councillor Burton for a steer from his particular perspective, but only if he's prepared to at this stage. He may say that he'd prefer to hear the debate, I don't know. Councillor Burton.
Well, thank you. I mean, I've come along tonight just to observe, listen, and input if I felt that it was useful. I mean, I would agree wholeheartedly with what's been said already. The difference between the Overview and Scrutiny Board at the moment and the committees is quite marked. I totally agree that what's happening at the moment, version 1, is taking a lot of time and effort, and it's actually affecting the scrutiny from the other two committees, because the Democratic Services officers' time is tied up, and therefore they have less time for the committee which I consider to be most important, children's. Looking back, the reason the Overview and Scrutiny Board ended up with extra meetings was purely their decision, wasn't it? It wasn't until I think it was the 8th of July 19 that they decided to go to 2 meetings, because it didn't. I'll be corrected. It did not come to this committee at the time. Therefore, it was their choice, and it's a choice which has just been continued, I believe. So that amount of time was their choice, and nobody else's. I have one comment to make later on, I think, about the membership of the Children's Committee, but I'll keep that until we get to that point.
Thank you very much. That's useful. So if at the appropriate time on particularly on the children's one, if you'd like to indicate, I'll bring you in at that moment. Councillor Cox, then Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, about the timing, and if there was, I mean, we all have restrictions in life, and why the Review and Scrutiny Board could not be restricted and given in its terms of its references a limit as to how many meetings it can hold a year or a month, and if you did that, then that might certainly reduce the workload and make it focus on the more important issues that it needs to be focused on. That would be a reform, and to tighten the references. I think that would help matters enormously.
Councillor Phipps.
That one doesn't move, so hopefully you can hear me, I take it. Yeah. Okay. I want to ask a question. It's referenced in paragraph 34, but it's part of the report, about key decisions. Can somebody please define a key decision? What is it? How do we know it's a key decision? That's the first thing I'd like to know. And then I'd just like to get a bit more information about populating the committees. A new committee, or would be 2 ONSs, whether there's a board and a committee or a committee and a committee. Will it be as per the usual political balance, or how is that going to work? Because obviously more councillors are required, and there are those that will not be able to populate the committee because they've already got other duties and things like that. And I just wanted a bit more of an explanation on that, as to whether they will be politically balanced or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. James, Head of Democratic Services.
Forgive me, Councillor Phipps, I was looking for key decision definition to read it out, but I think I caught the end of the second question, so please, I'll come back to you if I get it wrong. So key decisions defined in the Constitution. It is a decision that will result in the council on its own or in partnership with other organisations spending or saving £500,000 or more, with the exception of operational expenditure or savings identified within agreed service plans and budgets. In other words, that's already been approved, and therefore you're spending to that particular budget. So it's expenditure or savings over 500,000, and or it is likely to have a significant impact or effect on 2 or more electoral wards.
Sorry, at some point, could we have the paragraph number of the Constitution or something, so so I can find it at some point? Thank you.
Just to clarify, page 2 dash, so it's in the article, so it's 2-25 on page 25 of the articles, and it's paragraph 12.3.2.
So could you put your microphone on, Councillor Cox?
Can I just clarify, was it 500,000 and 2 or more wards, or was it all?
It's all. It says and or, but it's all. So it's either. And I think the other question was in terms of political balance, and was that in relation to each of the committees of ONS?
Yeah, there's more. I mean, I've heard there might be not enough councillors because they've got other duties that we won't be able to be populated in the normal way, but will they be populated in the normal way as far as political balance is concerned?
Yeah, in the first instance, they are committees of the council, and therefore political balance rules apply. Yes.
Can I answer your two questions, Councillor Phipps, or did you want to come back? Thank you. Councillor Clear.
Thanks, Chairman. If I can just kind of bring it back to obviously the report, which I have to say is really good, and the work as well that's been done by the officers. I have to say it's been tremendous. Also, the peer review, I think, is really positive. If we see what was said about this meeting, Chairman, of Audit and Governance, and obviously licensing as well, to my colleague to my right. I have to say, obviously, your stewardship in this and how we frame our discussions is very positive, and I think lessons can be learned and have already been learned with these options that have come up. For me, if I'm able to, Chair, I'm just going to speak on option 1, and then I'm going to leave it so any other members want to chat about that, and then as the discussion goes forward, I'm going to dive back in so we don't kind of have a scattergun approach and we can follow the trend, so to speak. So just speaking on option 1, I can be quite brief on this. I've sat on overview and scrutiny 48 times since 2019. I have to say it was inefficient. Officers did their best. The various chairs of that committee have done their best, but it's not fit for purpose. And I feel obviously we can't stay with that model, so we need to look at these other two options and be a bit more grown up about it as well. I think whatever option we land on, we're going to have a structure that is fit for purpose. I think if we look at the mother of all parliaments and how they do their scrutiny, I think we can take some lessons from that, and I feel one of these options does do that. So I will hold back for now until we move on to option 2. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Councillor Brooke.
Fine, thank you, Chair. I don't think there's any doubt at all that the current situation is broken. I think we're all agreed on that. But it raises a question in my own mind as to why is it broken? What caused it not to work? And there are a number of reasons for that, which I won't go into. Otherwise, I might be accused of being political, and I don't want that to be the case here, where we all get on very well and actually have good discussions. Is it to do with the power that the board has in being an overarching committee? Is it to do with the fact that having that overarching view, they come across all the portfolio holders in their scrutiny, and therefore there are challenges to those portfolio holders which can be perceived as being political? Those are some of the things going through my own mind, and therefore, in a way, those problems can be resolved keeping the same structure. It's because it's been to do with the behaviour of the people. Or if it is to do with the behaviour of the people, then by changing the personnel, you could perhaps make a change in the behaviour of that committee. If it's not to do with that, but to do with the power of that committee or that board, then that is another issue. Because if you scrap the board and just make another committee and you've got the same people, are you going to have the same problem? I'm just trying to work my way through through the issues. And do any of the proposals actually resolve that particular problem of politicising all the scrutiny? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But clearly we have got to do something. And it does seem to me that option 2 certainly is my preferred option, because it takes away the workload and spreads that, which is a critical element. You've got a balance between all the meetings, but there is still a certain level of power within the board, because I think you need to have some sort of overarching view somewhere. I know in Poole we had a scrutiny board which wasn't actually involved in the scrutiny itself. it allocated the various issues to particular committees when they came up, and that was the responsibility of of all the chairs and vice chairs of those committees. But of course, there was one person who had been elected the chair of that particular group of people. But that group of people was not in, because they were chairs, they were not involved in all the scrutiny. They were only involved in all their little bits. So there was all the separate committees working, but you still had that overarching view amongst all the chairs. And you get that certainly in, or can get that in option 2. You've got oversight of the function in option 3, but I'm concerned there with the actual numbers on the committee, because it is slightly discriminating insofar as I think certain groups of people would not be eligible to be on the committees because of the size of the committee and the political balance calculations. Whereas option 2 does allow for some members who wouldn't otherwise be on the scrutiny committee to at least be on the board, because it just got that bigger number on membership, and therefore does actually reach down to those other groups. So there are issues in terms of option 3, which I find a little bit discriminatory against some of the groups, the smaller groups or individuals on the council. And if you read in the report, there is a comment which actually suggests that more people want to be involved in the council and council decisions and what's going on. And option 2, with those slightly higher numbers, does allow for that. Whereas if you have a slightly smaller group, it goes down from 48, I think, to 44 members, you're excluding some people from that group of 44 simply because of the numbers in the committee itself. So I think there are those balancing elements which, again, favour option 2 to either of the others. So I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you, Councillor Brooke. Did you want to comment on that, Mr. Jones, in terms of the numbers, just so that we've got absolute clarity about that? Because I followed most of what Councillor Brooke was saying, but I didn't follow the last bit, I'm afraid.
Chairman, so the allocation of seats is table 3 on page 13 of the report, and this is a overall calculation of all the seats on all the committees under these models. So at the moment, under option 1, we have a total of 97 seats on all committees to which political balance applies, and applying the proportionality of each party, then I'll read down. So Conservatives get 52 seats of the total number, Liberal Democrats 17, and so on down, and it obviously balances at the bottom, and I'll explain the tick and the cross in a moment. So it balances down to the 97 at the bottom. Under option 2, with the establishment of an additional committee of 11 members, that goes up to 108 total seats, and then it applies the numbers. But these are calculations, so they are mathematical calculations that apply. You round up, and round down where you in the usual way. And I think what Councillor Brooke is saying there is that, for instance, under that model, well, actually, I'll contradict you slightly maybe, but under that model, Conservatives get an additional 6 seats under that option. The Lib Dems 1, Christchurch Independents 1 extra, Poole Independents 1 extra, Bournemouth Independent Groups 1 extra, and Labour and Unaligned get no extra seats. Now, the reason it's not balanced, and I'll come on to option 3 in a moment, the reason it's not balanced is because of the rounding up and rounding down. We would have to increase probably the disciplinary and investigatory committee. We'd have to increase the numbers on there in order to get political balance applied. Option 3, though, is obviously 4 committees with 11 members, so the total number of seats is 104. Under that option, the Conservatives, against the current model, get an additional 4 seats, but for a lot of them, there's no change. So the Lib Dems still get 1 extra. Christchurch Independents still get 1 extra. Paul Independents still get 1 extra. Bournemouth Independents would be the same as the existing, but 1 less than option 2. And the Labour and underlined remain the same under all 3 options. So I'm not quite sure that they get significantly less seats, because I don't think for most of them there's any change. I think proportionally, option 3 may be beneficial to the underlying groups, to the smaller groups, but I think it's just numbers. They are mathematical calculations. If you had every committee with 15 seats, it would just be a mathematical calculation. It's still roughly the same proportionality of seats.
I think you wanted to come back, Councillor Brooke.
If you take the committee size of 11 and you look at one of the groups which has 3.95% of all the seats, then they wouldn't be entitled to a seat on a committee of 11 because it is less than 0.5% of that committee size. Therefore, there is a choice taken away from those groups. They might have 4 committee places overall, but if there are committees that are larger than 11, then they would almost certainly be entitled to a place, whereas they have a committee size 11, they're not entitled to a place.
Yes, certainly.
I think we're perhaps getting into too much detail here, because actually the smaller groups technically may not even get an entitlement on seats, but the first principle is that all of the seats, the proportion of the allocation of seats on all of the seats, needs to be the same proportion as the overall proportionality of the council. So you start off with the total number, which is why I've included that here. There will be scenarios where you're absolutely right. If mathematically a group is not entitled to any seats on a committee, but because they are entitled to a minimum number, they're entitled to 4. It's the smallest number in any of these examples. They will have to be assigned a seat on a committee to which they mathematically wouldn't be entitled to, if that makes sense, because the first principle is they have to have 4 seats allocated to them. So I haven't got that detail. It's probably something I'd need to work out out of the meeting, but I can assure you they would get all those 4 seats, but the mathematics doesn't quite work like that. It's a calculation.
Sorry, being awkward on this.
I'd like to move on.
Yes, I understand where Richard's coming from, but it is something that we do need to consider, because there are more than just 4 committees here, so there are obviously plenty of places for people to be available. If their proportion works out that they're entitled to a seat on a particular committee because of the size of the committee, then they would go on to that place first. So it's because there's a statistical or a mathematical deprivation here in these calculations for some groups.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. I must admit that the political balance, I think, is a little tricky to really base this entire argument on, given that in a year it's going to change. You know, it could not change at all. It could be quite a drastic change. We won't know until next year. So I think that that's not something that I'm giving a particular weight to in this argument, because the difference anyway, even then, is so slight that it's not, it's really not enough to justify one issue over the other in any direction, in my opinion. And touching on another of Councillor Brooks' points from earlier on as to what's wrong with it, I think that it's a combination of all the points that he mentioned. There is definitely a culture issue, and there has been since the inauguration of BCP Council. With both administrations, with both oppositions, there has been a culture problem at overview and scrutiny. It's been as plain as you can get, and therefore for me, what is needed is a radical change, a radical rethinking of overview and scrutiny within the council, a real ground up shake-up, because in my opinion, just adding in another cabinet tract option, another cabinet tract committee, will just present us with another committee that has exactly the same culture issue because of the way its agenda is tabulated and formulated. So therefore, in my opinion, option 3 is the best because it has the most chance of fixing the hardest issue to combat, and that is the culture. You can try and fix the workload issue in a number of ways. The culture issue is the hard one. And the best way to do that, in my opinion, out of the 3 options we have here, is to remove that cabinet tracking, which is what this does, splits it up into 4 committees, and those 4 committees are exactly the same 4 committees as would be there under option 2. So if option 2 solves the workload, option 3 will solve the workload. But option 3 also solves the culture issue, in my point of view, at worst, at least. I wouldn't want to promise anything, but I think it's got the best chance to do exactly that. So at the moment, I'd certainly be minded that option 3 would be the preferable one. But again, I will wait and see what other members have to say. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Butt.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. You're very brave to have put forward your option so soon, but I would concur with much of what you've said. One of the questions was why isn't the board working? I think the board, one of the reasons why the board isn't working is because the board does not allow any autonomy of the other committees, of those we have and those which we would, I believe, create if we would go to option 2 or 3. There's no room there for self-governance, and that would give these committees and those subject to it confidence that it's being relevant and effective. At the moment, they have this overarching body, which actually is only there as a structure and calling, but it seems much more than that. So I think that's one of those reasons, and I would agree with the political discussion that Councillor Johnson put forward, that we could certainly not base anything today on politics, because that's not for us here at Audit and Governance anyway, being quasi-judicial. So although Councillor Brooks' argument was quite complex and quite well put, I don't think it's something that I would consider as part of the melee today. Thank you.
Councillor Fear.
Thank you, Chair. So looking at option 2, when I've gone through the papers and obviously listened to the debate as well, I do understand Councillor Brooks's view on this. Looking at it, I feel it's just messy. You've got 3 boards of 11, 3 committees of 11, 1 board of 50. The meetings then would be in different framework. We have different members on different boards in a sense of numbers. It doesn't seem to fit in. I feel like it's kind of a 1 step forward in some respects, but 2 steps back. I would feel very uneasy supporting this, and also I did go through this peer review as being part of it as well, and having that outside view on this situation, because members have been kind of locked in to this overview and scrutiny situation for so long, it's really nice to read an outside view. And I didn't get the feeling that option 2 was well received in that. It wasn't looked on positively enough compared to another option. So for me, I just don't feel like it would fit in with how we have been doing things and how this authority has been progressing. So for me, I wouldn't be able to support option 2, but I would like to come back when we move on to option 3. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Cox.
Well, I just wanted to ask the head of an Overview and Scrutiny Committee if he's ever been inhibited by the board in terms of the work he's done.
Would you like to answer that?
Would you like me to answer that, Chair?
Certainly, don't feel obliged to, but you're very welcome.
I'm quite happy to, because it's very interesting listening to the toing and throwing here. Personally, I mean, in children's Overview Scrutiny, as a committee, we've managed almost exclusively to keep politics out of the debate. I have been involved and invited by the chair of our board on a number of occasions to go and join them to put the children's perspective. I've also invited the chair of the Overview Scrutiny Board to come and join us at Children's to take part in our debate. I personally have never found I've been dictated to by the Overview Scrutiny Board. In fact, I felt that Children's have been allowed to do their thing, but with the I can think of a couple of occasions we've been asked to look at something by them, but we've been very pleased to do that. While I'm speaking, one thing which I've looked at these quite a lot and listened to the debate in the formal meeting. One thing that has recently struck me is the call-in, which of course we don't do as Children's at the moment because it's not part of our remit. It does strike me that there is a possibility with one of the options here, with everybody being able to call in, that if members had a mind, there could be a lot of calling, which may unpick some of the removing the work from the officers, because I believe, I may be wrong, but I believe the calling process is quite time inefficient, shall we say.
Councillor Cox.
Thanks, Richard. And it's kind of what I thought, and my concern, and I understand where you're going from. I really do, and I do completely agree with you in terms of the culture of the Overview Scrutiny Board at the moment. But the problem with emasculating it, it's a good word, as this would happen, is that you'll just move the problem somewhere else. And actually, if you're removing the cabinet tracking, you're effectively trying to get rid of. I'm not saying this is an intention. I'm just saying that might be the effect of getting rid of effective opposition. Because any good, whether it's Parliament or Council, needs a good opposition. It doesn't have a good opposition. You've just got some other one-party states, no matter what party it is, of councils you get up and down the country. They're usually pretty awful because they don't have a decent opposition. If you have a decent opposition, then you'll get a well-run council generally. And actually, my concern is that by taking away this cabinet tracking, you're going to be removing the opposition. And worse still, you're then you're probably the opposition, whether it's Conservatives or whether it's Liberal Democrats or Labour or Australian Independents, they'll just move. They'll move their politics downwards into the other committees, and because they'll have the calling, you may find that everybody gets infected by the political wranglings that might go on. But I would go back to what I originally said: is that the problem, I agree, is at the Overview and Scrutiny Board, and therefore let's deal with the Overview and Scrutiny Board, and let's deal with it, by restricting it, giving it some clear terms of references, and to try and giving them steers to calm down the wranglings.
Councillor Butt.
Just a quickie. Calling. Councillor Fear, in his opening gambit, said that let's be grown up about this, and I want to be very grown up about it. Now, calling is there for a specific purpose, and it's to call something in which evidentially may not be a policy that would work, or maybe a policy that needs work, or is a policy that needs attention. It isn't there as a political weapon. It isn't there to bat things around to make it difficult for the administration, or indeed the other way around. So call-in, I think, has to be used advisedly, but of course call-in has its own procedure, and if call-in doesn't fit the requirements, certain people can call it in, of course, on number, but then it has to be evidential, and it'll very, very quickly fall apart if that evidence isn't there. So I think we all have to be very careful. I'm perfectly at liberty to call something in if I don't like it. But the reason is, it's not that I don't like it. I have to have some evidence behind it as to why it may or may not work. And that's the rub that we've got to consider every time. So I'm concerned, maybe you were just calling it out, Councillor Cox, as just bringing it out into the open, so to speak. But if it were calling is to be used as a weapon, that is not us being grown up. That is not us taking anything forward. And we need to find a way today to have one of these options working for all of us, so that hopefully we can put it in train and have it as a working vehicle for next year's elections, so that whomever is taking us forward next year, they have a sound scrutiny process of which they can rely on. So I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Mr. Jones set out the calling procedure. It's a high bar, or two high bars. So I suppose that's, you'll know better than I, Mr. Jones. Is that why there have been so few call-ins? Because one or both of those have to apply. How many have we actually had?
We've actually had a total of 3 call-ins since 2019. Now, I mentioned the number of signatures would remain the same, so I think I was trying to reassure you there in that sense. But there, as Councillor Butt says, there has to be legitimate reasons. So again, for those who are familiar, and I may not get it exactly right, but it has to have, there has to state one of 3 reasons why a call-in is warranted, and that has to be a breach of the decision-making principle. The key one is a breach of the key decision, a breach of the decision-making principles as outlined in the articles. So they're set out in one of our articles, and that's what all of the call-ins so far have been based on. There are 2 other provisions. One is in relation to the forward plan. So if the Cabinet key decision is not on the forward plan in accordance with the regulations, then that is a reason for call-in. There's one other that I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. Lindsay's probably going to remember. Go on then, Ms. Marshall.
Yeah, the other reason is if the decision is not in accordance with the key policy framework or the budget.
So if I can just come back to Councillor Cox, because on that basis, you mentioned around the forward plan. Now, I think one of the issues we have at the moment is, and it's highlighted in the report and in the peer challenge, is it is a focus on Cabinet monitoring and the meetings are aligned to those dates. It states in the report that clearly for option 3 to work, it would require the forward plan to be populated in a timely way so that all of the scrutiny committees can forward plan their work and identify areas that they would wish to review in advance and call for reports. Clearly, if an item is late on a forward plan, then that would be a reason for a call-in. And that is, we do not want that. Call-in should be by exception. So something has gone wrong, effectively, or claimed to have gone wrong, for a call-in to be lodged. So there should be an exception. I think we are probably at the right sort of number, 3 in 3 years. And I think that's testament to what we're trying to achieve as all of the administrations that are so far.
Thank you for that explanation, Mr. Jones. Helpful. Thank you. Did you want to come back?
If that's okay, then thank you very much. Right, okay. That's very helpful. But I think the point I was trying to get over is that it is the infection of the other committees by doing it this way. And don't get me wrong, I'm not wedded to the overview and scrutiny board. I was a councillor in another authority which didn't have one, which had effectively the third model. And the problem with it is that if there's no opposition in the council to the cabinet, to the ruling of administration, whichever colour it is, then I just think that council is poorer, and therefore I believe the third option would make this council poorer in terms of the decisions it makes, because it doesn't have an opposition. It won't have an opposition because the opposition will be strengthened. That's the point I'm trying to make, and that therefore the other outlet of the opposition will be the overview and scrutiny boards, and they will become political. Whether they can call it or not is another matter.
Miss Marshall wanted to come back in.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just wanted to perhaps help visualise what a committee-only structure might look at in its committees, and to help address some of the concerns you might have about that displacement of political discussions. By moving away from a cabinet tracking model, it doesn't mean that those cabinet decisions cannot be interacted with. And I think if you had 4 equally standing committees, you would see a hybrid of cabinet decisions coming forward, but having to be planned to come forward to overview and scrutiny a little earlier than they currently do, In all honesty, at the moment, the organisation has quite an easy way of integrating into overview and scrutiny with its executive decisions. It just produces the same report to both. It's not unusual for a council to receive a separate report earlier to overview and scrutiny, if you are to look at that classic pre-decision scrutiny type of work. Ideally, you might be bringing forward a paper that is going to go to Cabinet, but you bring it forward early enough that overview and scrutiny can actually shape those decisions so that they're not only rubber stamping it or raising their concerns, but with little opportunity for that to be addressed, but they're actually looking at the key areas of that policy decision, whatever it may be, and giving their view so that those can be brought into the further development of that work. And the other way that overview and scrutiny might engage in those Cabinet decisions is by doing that pure overview work that I talked about earlier, which is very proactive, creating the evidence base that will formulate policy that executive decision makers can take forward. Clearly, that takes a lot of close working, perhaps some culture change, but that is what is considered good practice. And I think we could see a mixture of all those ways of working if we all signed up to that.
Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Lindsay. You covered most of the points there as well, actually. The only other one I was going to mention, and Councillor Cox mentioned the opposition. Scrutiny shouldn't be, I know we're in a political environment, and I know I'm not naive in that sense, but party whips, it's quite clear in the Constitution, is incompatible with the role of overview and scrutiny. And I think we should be a cultural shift, and I think it's identified in the peer challenge, is to actually challenge from whatever group, whatever party you're in. And I'm not sure certainly the current model is not consistent with that, because it is just focusing on Cabinet reports. That is the essence, and therefore it's seen as the opposition. And I think culturally, we should be in a position, and we should have an ambition where scrutiny is openly scrutinising issues that are coming forward, regardless of politics. I think that's the culture we should be aiming for as the head of democratic services, and try to be politically neutral.
As indeed we are on this committee too, so it's a very fine line to tread. I appreciate that, but members, you're doing very well keeping on that line thus far. Could I? No. I was looking at you, Councillor Cox, just to make sure that you weren't coming back, because I wanted to move on to the next person who had indicated, and you haven't come back. So, Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. It was just to come on that point, but Ms. Marshall's actually shot my fox quite brilliantly there. I think that part of that culture issue that I spoke about is the fact that at the moment overview and scrutiny is just packed with whatever is going to Cabinet on that particular given week, and that removes any possibility of ONS doing any of the other work. We, as Lindsay said, we forget about the O of ONS. And when you split it up and you split it into these four, and you give all the committees that bit more time before Cabinet comes along, and so it's not just intrinsically linked, and their entire agenda is normally dictated to them by whatever's coming up, in a week's time or whatever it is. It is just, it will. That's why I think that the culture will be changed, because it gives so much more time, so much more space. And so much more fluidity for the overview and scrutiny committees, all four of them. So I don't think it will strangle the opposition in any sense. They will get hopefully they will get a tailored report for every given thing they wish to bring in. They won't have to deal with them all in one big go. They'll have plenty more time to look at things, and more time to think about that then afterwards, and more time between whenever any political battling does go on in overview and scrutiny, and then the ensuing Cabinet, where I'm sure the voices will be aired again, and then the ensuing council after that, where we will all be doubtless in the room until 1 o'clock in the morning yet again. So, I don't think it will stifle the opposition in any way, and in fact, I would say that a working overview and scrutiny board will give an opposition a far better platform to scrutinise any administration that is in place, and not be adverse to that. Thank you, Jim.
Councillor Brooke.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, it's points that have been raised, and Lindsay certainly presented that information exceptionally well. I was going to come onto that point that clearly, if you're following the cabinet or tracking cabinet as has been and based purely on the reports, yes, you are missing something, and it has led to the problems that we've got. So the answer, or part of the solution, is to approach cabinet in a different way, but not exclude them or put them to one side and ignore them. And so it's really coming back to this idea, and this is where I disagree with the words overview and scrutiny. To me, it's one whole process. Pre-scrutiny deals with the build-up to a policy being made. You are looking at the processes and everything else that goes into that, and some of the initial decisions, which means you do have to look at topics and issues early, but you've got to know what those topics and issues are. And once you've had the implementation of that, you look at, has that implementation resulted in improvement for the council? If so, good. If not, why not? And that's where you come back in that post-implementation element of scrutiny. So it is a whole single process. You can call it overview and scrutiny if you like. I call it scrutiny full stop. Pre and post. And I think if we are going to approach the topics that are coming to cabinet in that way, rather than when it is too late to do anything about it, because at the end of the day, as we run it at the moment, cabinet doesn't have to accept any of the recommendations that come from overview and scrutiny. And there again, you have that political element coming in, because 99 times out of 100, cabinet will reject the recommendations on principle, on political principle. I've hardly seen any of the recommendations that have come forward from ONS get accepted. The one I can think of that really did was to do with the local plan and the issues and options consultation and when it should take place. It was the same in pool. You put forward really good recommendations and they were just basically, no, we're not going to take any notice of them, we're still going our way. And the whole system doesn't work. And it's that whole approach that tends to bring in the political elements into it. Whereas if you can start early enough in the process, asking the right questions, how are you going to approach this? How are you going to work out your policy? What are the steps you're going to take? You can structure that work and you can make a very big difference. So yes, I agree that the committees can deal with that if we change that approach to cabinet, but we mustn't let cabinet off the hook, because you still have to have that post-scrutiny, post-implementation scrutiny as well. Now, if you change that approach, and you suggest you were making that same point, Toby, you don't have to get rid of the board that can still have its other elements and be the committee, if you like, that deals with call-ins, because I think it's important that call-in is dealt with sometimes with members who are not specialists in a particular subject, because they will ask the right sort of questions, because they'll be wanting to find out. Whereas if you are an expert in their field, you might not be actually going to direct your questions to what is really important. So I think there's a need for at least an overarching view to help deal with the call-ins, and that will come in and work with Model 2. But the overall approach would work whether it is Model 2 or Model 3, because you are approaching all the policies, all the strategies with that pre and post element. I just happen to prefer call-in being attached to one particular body that becomes specialist in the call-in process, because it is dealing with how things have been developed. Have they followed the right path? rather than I just disagree with it.
Well, you referenced Councillor Johnson, so I'll ask him if he wants to respond, and then I'll move on to the next speaker. Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, just to quickly, just so we don't get sidetracked on another issue, I agree with almost everything you just said, Councillor Brooke, except the way in which you think that option 2 will implement your, and address your concerns. I totally agree that any recommendations that come from overview and scrutiny need to be looked at in Cabinet and need to be seriously considered in Cabinet. And option 3, I think, provides the perfect platform for that if it takes place far before the Cabinet in which it's going to be discussed. At the moment, there are 2 days normally between the overview and scrutiny and the Cabinet. They get exactly the same report. There's no time for officers, portfolio holders or anyone to take a really good, serious look at the recommendations when there's already been several months' work going into what has been put before them in the first place. Whereas if you take option 3, you remove that Cabinet tracking, so things are brought in at that early stage. You have that, it's not quite a preliminary report, but an overview and scrutiny report they get to look at. The options can go through there, the recommendations can get made, and then you may have a couple of months for a different report with the other options in there to be written for Cabinet, and then obviously it will be up to any Cabinet as to whether or not they look at it. But there, I find you have option 3 providing you with the perfect way to do exactly what you want to do. Councillor Brooke, thank you, Chair.
Briefly, Councillor Brooks, I would like to move on if we can. Time is pressing, and there may not be agreement however long we speak.
You've basically said what I've said, and there's nothing stopping the Model 2 working in that way. All I'm saying is that you do need still to have someone or some board that is responsible for calling, and I think it's far better if there is one specialist committee that does that, and that you call the board. So if you just assign calling to the board topics that we've got in Model 2, it doesn't have to track Cabinet in the way that it used to track it. It works in the way that we've just said then, and therefore Model 2 or Model 3. But Model 3 does not deal with calling adequately enough.
Councillor Fear.
Thank you, Chairman. Sorry to change the order. I have a colleague to my right who's been chewing my ear off trying to get ahead of me, which I'm happy to yield. And also, I think if Councillor Phipps still want to comment on this bit before we move on, I'm happy to wait my turn as well. Thank you.
What you wish to speak on is something different. Is what you wish to speak on what we've been discussing, Councillor Butt?
It's by way, hopefully, to bring it to a close, Mr. Chairman.
And Councillor Phipps, on this particular topic, it is. So I'll go to Councillor Butt, Councillor Phipps, and then back to Councillor.
Okay, thank you very much. With regard to some of the points which Councillor Brooke has raised, and the talk about calling being specific, we, as you will remember, Mike, had a calling committee when we were in Borough of Poole, and it never sat, or it very rarely sat. And we had a chairman who was there twiddling his thumbs, and people were very cross because they had an SRA and he wasn't doing any work. Because they become self-reciprocating, don't they? If you have them, they do or they don't work. You either get lots and lots of work or you get nothing. And of course, we have a very strict process which we have to go through. I don't agree with your point that call-in should go to a board or somebody else, and that call-in should not go to the specific discipline of which it sits, its area, because those are the very people who have the skill sets and can dig down into the minutiae of detail to deal with the particular call-in in front of it. I certainly wouldn't want something from children's going to place. I couldn't see that, because the expertise, eventually we hope to pepper these overview and scrutiny committees with the correct expertise. I would not want people on my licensing committee there who didn't know anything about licensing. It would be of no use to me whatsoever, and I'm sure the same would go for planning, Toby as vice chair, and indeed for this committee. We've all got our skill sets and we need to apply them. The other matter, I think, was where you were very, very keen that the board stays. I think that we can say that I'm very, very keen that it doesn't for all those reasons. And I very much hope that we can move on because we do have two other options which are worthy of discussion. So I think we've perhaps all had our point on this and I'd like to move on. But of course, Mr. Chairman, Councillor Phipps has yet to speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Butt. We're not quite finished on this part yet, but we'll then move on to Councillor Fear. And then I really would like to try and draw this together to a decision, because we do have to deal with the appendix that will apply to whichever decision that is. We've been at this now for an hour and a half. I just remind you, I'm not anxious to finish, but others may be. Councillor Phipps.
Well, it's pretty much a simple question, I think. At the end of the day, we're looking at not following cabinet or whatever and widening it all and everything else. And it's all be very laudable about, we start things early and we'll be able to have shape it and all sorts of things have been said. Fine. Who decides what comes forward then and when and how early? And who makes that decision?
Could I perhaps ask Ms Marshall if you could answer that in terms of the process? That would be very helpful, I think.
Thank you, Councillor Phipps and Chairman. Well, it's for each committee to decide their own work plan, first of all. It is within the gift of scrutiny to decide what they want to look at. But in terms of making that process work for the organisation and helping scrutiny to add value to the organisation, that is a whole organisation responsibility. I think it's written into the report, the paragraphs within there, that scrutiny will only succeed if it's working within a culture that enables it to work in a value-added way. There's a requirement for the executive to populate the fourth plan in a timely way and to have informal, effective conversations with scrutiny so that scrutiny knows what's coming up and where it can direct its resource. And then it's incumbent upon that scrutiny committee to determine what areas they want to look at and to choose things that will add value based on those conversations and their knowledge of the forward plan. So it's very much a whole council responsibility. And I don't think you can point to one person or one responsibility or one rule within the Constitution to say that's where that authority lies.
Does that answer your question?
Well, I think so. So they will need to know what's coming forward. They need to be informed. Exactly.
And I think from what we've heard, that would be earlier than is currently the case. Because otherwise they simply wouldn't be able to do it in the time and there wouldn't be the officer resource available to do it. So I think it brings it forward, does it not? Councillor Fear.
Thank you, Chairman. And also thank all members really for this debate. Ms Marshall's been touching on the point of culture change, which is obviously wrapped up in one of these three choices that we will go for. I feel I've already taken that on this evening, because when I came here after reading all the papers, option 2 and option 3, as Councillor Brooks has already said, you know, there are some similarities, so I wasn't too sure which option I'd end up with. And actually, after the questions from Councillor Cox, Councillor Phipps and Councillor Brooks, and the clarification, wonderfully done by the officers, those questions and those clarification points have actually pushed me to option 3. So I'd like to thank, obviously, for those clarifications. Some of them I didn't have written down myself. So it's wonderful when we have that good, positive discussion in that culture change. Overview, I think we do need more of this. I'd probably be on the opposite side of Councillor Brooks when he said it's just scrutiny. I think overview is important. And we haven't had enough of that, I think, with the old option 1. And I think option 3, looking at that and how that will break down, I think that's perfect for that. We'll have equal members, we'll have equal boards. Also put in process above politics. Option 2, as the head of Democratic Services said earlier, the Conservatives will gain 6 seats. On option 3, it's 4. So if we wanted to smash and grab, then obviously, and I don't come here as a Conservative, I come here as a member of Audit and Governance, Chairman. But if I wanted to smash and grab, well, option 2 would obviously be a legitimate choice for me. But it's not, because I want to put the process above politics. We have the calling procedure. Again, demonstrated by a head of democratic services, which is very fair, and we seem to be on the right track and hitting good standards on that. So that reassures me for that aim of it. Councillor Johnson going on about how the process will enable members. First of all, it's member-led on these committees, and secondly, we're going to be able to have a lot more time for not only cabinet but members and officers to get round the table and discuss on certain issues, which I think is great. That is a good culture change because everyone's working together, which we all have been agreeing on this evening. Again, I go back to the peer review. That's been screaming out when I've been just rereading it. Whilst the discussion was going on, they're screaming out for option 3. I don't really see it leaning towards 1 at all, and not very much to 2, but 3. So for all those points, Chairman, and again, thank you to everyone for their points. I think it's been really good, and this is how I see these boards going forward. Really, more discussions, more collaboration, and for me, the best option for that is option 3. So I would like to make a move. Obviously, we would have to go through the appendix after that, but I would like to make a move. That option 3 would be the one we recommend. I seek a seconder. Thank you.
So that is moved by Councillor Fear, seconded by Councillor Johnson. If you would like to speak to the move, do you wish to speak in seconding it, Councillor?
No, thank you, Chair. I think Councillor Fear summed up, and I've already spoken.
I'd rather gauge that would be your reaction, actually, because we are in danger of repeating if we're not careful. Councillor Butt.
I will do my utmost not to repeat, Mr. Chairman, but I do want to be clear in why I support the proposal and the words that I've heard today from everybody. I believe that option 3 certainly has the capacity for officers to support the ONS system, which of course in the peer review and all the discussions that were had over a long period of time is one of those prerequisites. It also provides for all members to deliver within the required budgets, because we have to be careful with regard to budgetary constraints in these cash poor times. And with the chairs and vice chairs, which of course we haven't touched on, the chairs and vice chairs keeping us informed with regard to the dialogue that's going on, because it was agreed in here that chairs and vice chairs, they had been meeting. I'm sure that Mr. Jones can perhaps elucidate more on this on an ad hoc basis to take forward the dialogue and the themes and their effectiveness of the 2 committees and the board. And if that were to be continued, but on a regular basis, that would be the overarching structure, which is really what the board does now, but at no extra cost. And actually, as those individual chairs and vice chairs have an ownership of their own discipline in its completeness, it would be much better advised and informed. I do firmly believe that the removal of the ONS board is very appropriate. And as I said before, all credit must go to them for their work and the fact they've managed to keep going for this long, and all the chairmen, because it's been pretty hard going. But regrettably, as has been observed by the peer review, it's not working. And if it is broken, then we do need to definitely mend it. No longer getting bogged down in this minutiae of detail, which they have done so. And lastly, I'm sure there are many more positives which we haven't heard yet. The agreement to have 4 bespoke themed ONS committees will allow each committee to grow in its own expertise, and I think that's something we're losing. I know that Richard said that he didn't feel that he was cut down by the board, but he certainly felt that his words were affecting scrutiny of other committees, and I would agree with him there. So everybody would have autonomy and be able to move forward together eclectically. And it's a working train, isn't it? It will grow, it will get better. Miss Marshall's told us about all the different types of work that can be done with regard to the most important thing, which is section 13, enabling the voice and concerns of the public to be heard, which is really our main concern, and reflecting in the council's decision-making process, because that's why we're here, that's why we're all here, is to speak and with our public and make sure that our residents understand what is going on and they can join us in creating and delivering on that policy. So I would certainly support the proposal as so seconded. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Councillor Brooke.
Very, very quickly, just to pick up a point that Councillor Butters made. I understood Richard to have made the point about affecting other committees was to do with the time and the impact on democratic services in terms of their support and had nothing to do with the difference in the autonomy. And I think Councillor Butt has misrepresented Richard in this particular instance.
Well, we have Councillor Burton with us, and if he wishes to, would you like to represent what you said, please?
Oh dear.
Let's just hear what Councillor Burton has to say.
I do hate it when people write down what I say, because I should do that myself, I suppose. No, the point I was making, I think, as Councillor Brooks said, is that at the moment, officer time is being invested heavily in the ONS board, which means less officer time is available for the other committees, rather than me saying, so option one being causing that problem as it is at the moment. I wasn't suggesting that the Overview and Scrutiny Board was controlling what happened at Children's, or that Children's had a big impact into Overview and Scrutiny Board.
So as far your interpretation from your experience is that it's far more an issue about the availability and allocation of remaining resources that has been the issue. And if there has been any change, it's been about the prioritisation towards the board rather than the committees.
I'd like to also emphasise, though, that I do feel that the officers have been very supportive of children, so I'm not complaining, but I just have that feeling.
No, I understand. I understand the point, because I'm experiencing the issue even within this committee of the availability of resource, not a lack of willingness to provide it, but it's just its availability. So as we expand our agenda, as we have done quite rightly, we've tried to do that at a pace that can be absorbed without affecting other parts of the council. Does anybody else wish to speak on this before we move on? I've got one question actually from Ms Marshall, but I'll leave that for a moment. Councillor Phipps.
Just quickly, really, I don't think I can support option 3. It just seems to be taking away from democracy. That's all I'm going to say, really. I'm not happy with it. That's all I can say.
I just wanted to ask Ms Marshall, I was going to take you to paragraphs 41, 42, 43, which is the relationship between this committee, Audit and Governance, and Overview and Scrutiny. And something I wrote down a long time ago in terms of that relationship was to do everything we could to provide interface rather than overlap. Because I think Audit and Governance has a role to play in a number of areas, but it mustn't overlap. It must keep itself contained. And I just wondered, Ms Marshall, is that the theme that's coming through in those 3 paragraphs? It's a little bit about looking at our own, but we do need to do that in the process.
Yes, thank you, Chair. That's a good point to bring out. Currently within the Constitution, there isn't any reference to the role of audit and governance in relation to scrutiny, but there is guidance out there which is helpful for us to refer to. And so what we have done in all the options provided to you is to draft in some guidance into the Constitution around how ONS and audit and governance can interact. And that is exactly the point, is that they have similar skill set and areas of reference, and there is a need for them to interface, as you say, but not duplicate each other. There's a reference to, under option 3, informal chairs and vice chairs meetings being required under the Constitution, and the chairman of the audit and governance being invited along to those meetings, which is often the place where the current chairs and vice chairs, I think, would say that they are able to explore their areas of overlap, cross-cutting issues where they can add value by working together. So those sorts of conversations can take place and include the chair of audit and governance to make sure that that is covered. But there is also a reference written into all 3 constitution options that the audit and governance chair and vice chair should not sit on scrutiny, to make sure that there's an independence maintained between the 2 functions.
To be clear, I've got absolutely no ambition to sit on
any part of overview and scrutiny personally, but the point I'm making is that our experience here on this committee is that there's, in addition to our fairly heavy workload, there are occasions when work is sent to us to deal with. Usually, if there's anything that we want to engage with in terms of overview and scrutiny, we've done that by way of an informative note, which is fine, except there isn't any necessity for follow through and a return of whatever that conclusion is. And looking at it really from our own point of view, I'm just making that point that there are occasions when some of the work that we've done on a particular specific topic might have benefited if we were able to have some sort of interface that would allow more work to be done outside of this committee to report back to us on a future occasion. And members will know the kind of topics that we've been looking at around BCP Council, and many of them have been in these early stages because the council is still finding its way around its constitution. Did you want to come back, Ms. Marshall?
Yes, thank you. Just to say, I think that I think it's just been a matter of capacity. There hasn't been sufficient capacity within mainly the ONS board, which would most closely align to the functions of this committee, to consider where it may interface. And that is also true of the support staff who, as I referred to at the start of the meeting, have that skill set to help support the scrutiny function and look wider than we currently are. There needs to be sufficient capacity for them to explore more innovative ways of working, and that can include joint working with this committee. And it's all around releasing capacity to enable that to happen.
Thank you. I'm sorry if members might think I sort of down a little bit of a sidetrack, but I think the function of audit and governance is, well, I obviously, and I'm sure all of you think it's a very important one, and I will make sure that we play our part and are able to fulfil that through the function of overview and scrutiny. I haven't had anybody else who's indicated to me, so we've got a move which is supportive of option 3. That move has been made by Councillor Fear and has been seconded by Councillor Johnson. I will go to the vote in that case, so all those in favour of that move, please indicate. And those against? So that move is carried by 6 votes to 3. So that concludes the first recommendation outcome, and I'm grateful to you members for what's been a very interesting and I think extremely well-tempered discussion to get us to a conclusion on that recommendation. Now that takes us to the second recommendation that we'll need to deal with, and that's around the appendix that relates to that option, and I'm going to pass back to Ms Marshall to help us take us through that part of the agenda. Ms Marshall.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm assuming that members are looking at this agenda in the Modern Gov app in the main. If so, I can take you to the relevant page numbers. Clearly, they're going to be different if you're looking at the appendices on the internet site. I don't propose taking you through all the constitution amendments that are highlighted in Appendix 4, which relate to the option you've just voted on. If there are any specific queries or concerns on anything that is drafted or the way it's drafted, we can deal with those. But there are 3 amendments that I have highlighted that I think I should just draw out for you so you are aware, because they're not necessarily dealt with in the report. And as I said to you earlier, there are some changes recommended which are just about strengthening or giving clarity to current rules. So if I could proceed on that basis, I'll take you to page 89 if you'd like to put that into the search box. And just highlight to you rule 7.2. This is a cabinet meeting procedure rule. This is important for you to be aware of, just because currently The chairman of ONS board has the right to go to cabinet and talk on matters on the agenda of cabinet. This clarifies that any committee chairman can go and talk to any recommendations that any ONS committee is making to cabinet, which is clearly a different thing from talking to cabinet agenda items and the strengthening of the current rights of ONS. I will then take you to page 96. Procedural 9.1. This again has been drafted into all the options. The aim of this is to add a bit more clarity to how scrutiny would take place of portfolio holders and officers. There is a statutory right for scrutiny to ask executive members and officers to come to scrutiny, and they should come unless there's a good reason why they cannot. But this does clarify that the debate should be had with the aim of maximising the effectiveness of scrutiny and, importantly, with respect and courtesy, which I think everybody would agree on, and is just about strengthening how those debates are had at scrutiny and will be useful for all the committees. I will then take you to page 100, a few pages down. And procedural 14.10. Just to highlight for you here, this is only a small tidy up, but these are call-in procedurals. And if a call-in is considered and it is referred back to Cabinet, there is a need to provide advice along with that referral back to Cabinet. The current procedure rule isn't clear enough on that, and it would be possible just to refer back to Cabinet but not actually give any advice, which wouldn't be effective. So this is just to clarify that and strengthen it.
Councillor Butt? 1410 we're on.
1410, thank you very much.
On page 100.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Marshall.
That is the sum of the changes that I feel I really needed to highlight to you. All the others relate to the mechanics of the option that you have discussed, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Members, have you any questions of Ms Marshall?
Not a question, but an observation that this just reinforces the complete emasculation of any opposition to the cabinet, and therefore I think we're going in a bit of the wrong way. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to be political. I just think that the politics, we are political. You know, you're in the Conservative Party, I'm in the Liberal Democrats. We are political. A lot of the decisions that are made are political, and therefore you need to bear that in mind. And there needs to be a backwards and forwards as to what decisions are made, and therefore I believe whichever cabinet, whether it's a Conservative or a Liberal Democrat cabinet, should hear what opposition feel about a particular subject. And just feel as though in this model, I'm assuming that all the chairs of the committees will be Conservatives for the next year, therefore there will be no opposition. Yeah.
Well, I will respond to that, but from the point of view of our discussion here, I've no way of knowing who's going to be chairing or anything else. But what I would say is I'd remind you about what I said in the introduction to this meeting, which is that what we're trying to do is to improve and get a model that is going to be fit for purpose. We will have, if we can get something through council, we will have a year to see how well this beds down. Who knows who will be in those positions, what the composition of the council will be in just over a year's time. None of us know. And so my focus, and I hope everybody's focus, is very much on what is the best model to deliver a proper overview and scrutiny, rather than actually thinking about how does that work with X, Y and Z and the numbers that we've got at the moment. And I'm just conscious that you have very deeply felt reasons for having the position you have. But I'm not sure that it necessarily follows that this means that there will be a situation whereby cabinet decisions can't be held to account. I'm not sure that that's right, and so perfectly entitled to make that view, as you have done consistently, Councillor Cox, but we've resolved that item, and this part of it is about how it will work in practice and the changes that are needed to the Constitution in this appendix. So I'm not arguing with you. I'm just saying that what our focus is as a committee is a little bit narrower, perhaps, but more focused on the longer term and trying to get something that really works better. So, members, any other questions for Councillor Rice?
It was more an observation regarding the additional writing in section 9.1 about all discussions will be based on respect and courtesy. That's well, I would love to see that happen. I don't think it's as simple as just writing it in there that it will happen. So it was just to I was wondering whether you had any comments on how to enable that to happen, or whether that's not for this evening.
Could you just refresh us which page you on?
Oh, I'm on page 96.
Thank you very much.
Through you, Chair. Yeah, I wouldn't like to carry the weight of that responsibility purely on my shoulders. But I would refer you back to what the comments I made earlier around culture and the need to sign up for that across all parties in terms of their interactions, overview and scrutiny. Just the background of this procedural, that has been strengthened because further down, and I cannot take you to it immediately, but there is a procedural that relates to inviting partners or external parties in for scrutiny, and that phrasing is in there. And there's no reason why we shouldn't apply that phrasing to our own relationships within the council. So that's why that has been brought in. But yes, in terms of actually enacting that, that's a matter for members. But it does give the chair a little bit of extra support, I think, in terms of managing meetings.
I think it's a point well made, Councillor Rice. Fortunately, it I don't think has ever applied within this committee, but I do think one of the things that comes through to me within the Fair Challenge review is very much along those lines. And I think from the chair's point of view in a meeting, actually having that means that there's a greater chance of being able to hold members to account if they stray off that narrow path. That's probably the best we can do with it, actually.
Yeah, I suppose I was thinking that it would be useful to have a bit of training or guidance with members, because it can be something as simple as rolling your eyes. Like, I know that I have rolled my eyes in a meeting, and that can be, if you witness somebody rolling their eyes at what you say, it can be incredibly disrespectful. But in the moment, and unless it's pointed out to you, if you've grown up in a family home where everybody rolls their eyes, for example, then it's sort of, there's quite a lot of basic stuff I feel that we could benefit from having a little bit of training.
Well, it may be something that the Standards Committee might want to take up. Probably not for us to, but it certainly could be. I don't think it would be appropriate for us to send an informative note to Standards, but it certainly would be if individual councillors or indeed group leaders felt that communication should be made about such training, but I'd suggest it's done through Standards. So members, are we happy to agree that appendix that Ms Marshall has now gone through in terms of recommendation B,
So that the draft pages of the Constitution appended to this report be considered and approved for recommendation to full council in accordance with the agreement made under A above. Would we be happy with that? Councillor Burton, and then I'll come back to Councillor Rice.
Just a question, Chair. I did mention earlier on about the membership of Children's Committee, and I was wondering whether this might be a time to put this into the Constitution, because at the moment we have the councillors, we have the cooperative members from the diocese and the school governors, but we also have members of the young people's elected members. We voted on that as children's early on at the beginning of BCP, and they've attended since then. It's not mentioned in the Constitution. I was wondering whether there might be a time now to add it in.
It's a very good question, Councillor Burton. I wonder, Ms Marshall, could you respond, please?
Yes, certainly. I think this is a matter that's been considered before. I don't think there is a strongly held view in relation to it, and clearly your view as practising chairman over the last few years is important there. The only thing I would say is that the membership is at 11 members, and it has 4 co-opted members in addition. There is sometimes a risk with putting on or writing into a membership co-opted members that you start to imbalance the membership, whereas there isn't anything to stop you flexibly inviting those people to come and contribute. So the only thing I would say is that in my experience, it's better to keep that as a flexible arrangement rather than written in, which you're then bound to.
Presumably that's within your gift as chair anyway, to invite, as would be quite proper anyway, to invite in those additional people externally.
Yes, it is, and we agreed as a committee to do that. Far from me to speak for the young people. I just feel that they would like to be mentioned, so they have a right to be there. It's the same with the other cooperative members. I mean, I know the young people were quite keen on having voting rights, for instance, earlier on, but we persuaded them that wasn't possible. But having their names mentioned in the Constitution might give them some empowerment, shall we say.
Do you want to come back again, Ms Marshall?
As I said, I don't feel strongly about it. I don't think there's any reason why not, other than to say that you don't necessarily know who you're going to get, as members, and that's where that imbalance can come up. You know, I think voting rights generally, it's not good practice to assign them to co-opted members. And other than the diocese members, etc., that you have by statute, which is why they have voting rights clearly only on education matters, though. I don't see a big issue with drafting that into the Constitution if that is the view of this committee, that's supported.
Can I just ask Mr James for a little guidance as democratic? Sorry to put you on the spot, but I think we're being put on the spot, so we need to be properly informed.
Thank you, Chairman, for joining me on the spot. So I think Lindsay's probably covered the issues. I think I share the reservation or the concern that by drafting into the Constitution, it would have to be worded in such a way that it is an option to and not a requirement to appoint, because at that point you could end up being in quorum if you're not very careful. You don't get those representatives. They decide to withdraw, and they're not in attendance. So I'm slightly nervous at it. We certainly could draft in a discretionary appointment, but it may be one that we add to your Constitutional Review Working Group, Chairman, and add it in that way with some careful thought, and we can look at experience from other authorities rather than a quick reaction.
Vice Chairman?
Then we can leave ourselves open to other committees, and I'm thinking of some that I'm on, like the Lower Gardens Trust, where we have outside people on that trust. Russell Coates are the same. I know it's different, but it's similar, and I think it's better unwritten than written down, because you could in the future get other committees coming in and saying, well, what about us?
If I could make a suggestion, this isn't fudging it so that we don't have to make a decision, but I don't want to do this on the hoof, actually. What I would prefer to do is to take up Mr. Jones's suggestion of doing some background, some research, some discussion with you, and indeed your Vice Chairman maybe as well, I don't know, and then, if appropriate, bringing that back to the Constitution Review Steering Group, which is to meet on a number of topics in the next few months in order to get further changes to the Constitution to Council much later this year. And we don't want to go any further than later this year, because we're then running out of time in the final municipal year of the Council. But that does give you the opportunity to continue that and then to bring it in, and actually at the time of that working group discussing the matter, inviting you to come in and support whatever arguments you feel are appropriate at the time. So I think that's probably a sounder way of dealing with it, rather than just deciding it tonight without the informed information, probably from the monitoring officer as well, who isn't present tonight.
I would repeat what I said. It was a question at the beginning whether this would be the right time. I think I have the answer to that question. But we have decided the right time.
Yes, indeed. Did you indicate, Councillor Butt?
It was just very quickly to say I support what we could put forward and Richard's question. Of course, the actual makeup of the scrutiny in itself is in the Constitution under scrutiny, so all that iterate as to who does what to whom would be there. So it may not be necessary to have it in this specific area of the Constitution, because it's already under review and scrutiny in great detail, I'm sure, with regard to that particular committee. So that's perhaps one of those matters that can be discussed when those discussions are had, as to whether there's a need for it to be further iterated, because we're just talking about the actual elected members in this instance. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that Children's is a bit special in this respect, always has been. I think if I could ask officers to follow through in the way I've suggested, that would be the best route. Any other questions on the appendix? Councillor Russ.
Yeah, I was just wondering, with regards to what the different committees are allocated, there's nothing in there specifically regarding carbon footprint and biodiversity, both of which we have a climate emergency, declared emergencies on both. So it was just whether we can add some wording in. So pages 71 and 72. Just to help to clarify that.
Yes, I assume, Ms. Marshall, you're going to be speaking to the place overview and scrutiny and the breakdown of the subjects that they cover. Could you perhaps answer Councillor Rice's question, please?
Yeah, when the Place Committee was originally conceived as an idea, there was a strong wish to make that a climate change committee, but clearly that wouldn't have taken enough of the remit of the overview and scrutiny board that is currently in situation to make that a viable way forward for a committee. So it's an environment committee, it's a place committee, looking at an array of place type matters. But that's where I would see that sitting. That said, I would highlight, as is written into the report, that the committees are designed to align to portfolio holder remits. And those are changeable. There may be a need to look at that and change that around in the future for all different areas. But that capacity will be there through an annual report to Council for scrutiny. Behind this model, and not within the Constitution because it's far too detailed, there will sit a document that we will maintain which sets out what goes to which committee and how that aligns to different portfolio holder areas, because there will be from time to time queries around what goes where. But I would certainly see that sitting in place.
Thank you very much. Councillor Rice?
Yeah, I suppose that they're quite broad. Carbon footprint and biodiversity seem to be equal to saying homes or cleansing or waste. So I would have thought it was reasonable to add them in to this document rather than, it just brings them up to the level that they should be at. They shouldn't be in a sub-document, is my feeling. So I think it's relatively simple to add them in there. We've got sustainability in the place one, and so carbon footprint would be in there. And then in terms of the biodiversity, I assume that would go into the same place one.
Ms Marshall?
Yeah, just sorry if I wasn't clear before. The reason the particular areas are highlighted in the sort of top line description of the committees is because that is lifted from those portfolio holder descriptions for their areas. Obviously, the portfolio holder areas cover a great deal of detail that aren't all listed in their top lines. So that's why it's drafted in the way it is. None of those top line areas list carbon footprint or biodiversity. That's why it's not written in. Nevertheless, if it's the will of the committee, I don't think that there's a problem to do that.
Could I just ask, is that for us to do, or is that for the Overview and Scrutiny Committee to do at its first meeting? I don't know. So what would be your view?
My view, if we're being clear, is to stick to the portfolio holder description so that we have clarity, and then each committee can adopt a terms of reference for clarity at their first meetings and say, for clarity, this is the detail of what we look at. That might be a way forward.
I think that's very helpful. I'd be disinclined to go from the framework that we've got and make an exception or two exceptions, rather than to say once that Overview and Scrutiny has its first meeting, that is the time to widen its remit or more detail its remit, because it's then their body of work. I'd be very reluctant to see this Audit and Governance Committee doing that. It's much more specific to the environment overview and scrutiny, in my view, and that's what I think what I'm hearing from Ms Marshall. So obviously that's the time which I am absolutely certain you will make your views known.
Yes, I suppose I can understand where you're coming from. I suppose I'm hinting at my disappointment that it's not in their roles already.
Well, my get out of jail card on that one is that I didn't write the report. Councillor Cox.
Yeah, just because it's in the portfolio holders' descriptions, I do not believe that should be a reason for, for putting these headlines in. I think that's irrelevant, because actually the portfolio holders' descriptions could change at any time. Different administrations come and go, and they have different priorities. We have clearly committed to a climate change emergency, and therefore that should be, in my opinion, a cornerstone of what we should be doing. And it's irrespective of which one administration. I appreciate Councillor Fear doesn't probably treat it very seriously, but it's actually important. We all voted for it, and therefore it should be clearly front and centre. So I'd like to agree with Councillor Felicity.
I think the point that I'm making from the chair is about the consistency of what we have in front of us, having been lifted from the various portfolio remits, and it isn't about that not being a priority at all. Quite the reverse, actually. My suggestion is that Overview and Scrutiny Committee, at its first meeting, should be discussing this and making suitable arrangements as to what areas of work it's covering. So it's not trying to downgrade it at all. It's probably helping to elevate it out of this debate, actually. Councillor Fear.
Thanks, Chair. I will be short, so I feel like we have reached the end of this really productive meeting. We were very close. Councillor Cox, for that culture change I spoke about earlier. I put the olive branch over saying that it was kind of down to you that I wanted to go to option 3 with your brilliant questions and the discussion we've had. I do take it very seriously, the names of these committees, but as we've heard about 3 times now, it is down from the portfolio holders members preview. That's where we're getting it from. So I'm not going to go and repeat it a 5th time, but I feel we've heard that, and hopefully next time that culture change at Audit and Governance, we will have it for the whole time and not just the 99%. So thank you, Chair.
Mr. Cox, your microphone is on. Does that indicate you're wishing to speak, or can we just wrap this item up? And I'd encourage Councillor Rice to do as I've suggested, and that opportunity will occur at some time fairly soon, I hope, after the beginning of the new municipal year in May. So, members, can we agree that second recommendation on the basis that I read out just now? Do you wish to go to a vote? All right. So, all those in favour, please indicate. And those against? In terms of the third recommendation, is the tidying up, if you like, recommendation to the necessary and consequential technical and formatting related updates and revisions to the Constitution being made by the monitoring officer in accordance with the powers delegated. Can we agree that third recommendation? Thank you very much indeed, members. Just before we close the meeting, I would like to reiterate, if I may, my thanks to the officers for all the work that they've done on this. This paper that we have before us has largely been the work of Ms Marshall, as we've heard, ably supported by colleagues in democratic services. It's exceptional because it's exceptionally good in terms of its work and how it's brought about the issues into focus that we've needed to look at. That isn't to say that other papers are not, but there's no question in my mind whatsoever that more work than would normally be the case has gone into this and has been under rigorous examination before it even got to us as members. So I'm very grateful to the officers. I'd like Mr Hanson please to record our thanks for that to Miss Marshall and indeed to the input of Mr Jones throughout as well, because I don't think we would have the kind of quality of paper without that additional effort that's been made. So thank you both, thank you all very much. And thank you, members, for conducting this meeting in such a helpful and focused way. It's been appreciated, difficult subject. Now all that has to be done is to take these recommendations through council. So what challenge is that lies ahead, I wonder. So members, thank you for your time this evening. Councillor Phipps.
Said when you do report to council, you would be good enough to say that the voting was not unanimous.
I noted the voting and I will be doing so very definitely. So members, that concludes our business for this evening and I close this meeting at 20:23. Thank you.